So I represent that Marx's direct example here graphically, just to try and make a connection on why I'm doing it at all. Okay, so you can see on the right hand side the least productive, it's in inverse order, right? 1/4 of wheat is produced by investing 50 and selling for 60, but in a B, more fertile, you invest 50 but you can sell 2/4 now for 120. C, you invest 50, you can sell 3/4 for 180, and therefore you get a surplus profit of 120, which becomes the rent. And example D, which now you invest 50 but you can sell 4 bushels at 60 a bushel, and that means that you get an income of 240, of which 180 is potentially is a surplus profit and potentially payable as rent. Okay, now this may or may not ring a bell for you. I hope it does, because what this now is a very close, very closely similar to, is that cost curve that we were looking at for oil. So this is in effect, Marx in effect gave us, not in this particular form, but in terms of the categories, he gave us a cost curve for agriculture, capitalist agriculture. Okay, next. Now, why does the wheat sell for 60? Because what we've got is 4 capitalists investing 50 each in production. That's 200, and they actually produce 10 quarters of wheat. So why on earth don't we just say that the average socially necessary labor time means that they should be selling their wheat for the social average of 24? Okay, and the reason is really important, right? It's because there's a limit. It's because production on the most productive land, which is our example D, which grows 4 bushels, 4/4 of wheat for a given investment, right? It's a limit on it. So you can't just expand production. That's the most, what's the word? That's the equivalent of the most innovating capitalist in a normal industrial sector, right? But that production cannot be expanded because there's a limit on it, okay? What that means then is that it appears that the marginal producer, which is capitalist A, is actually the controlling point. In other words, the price is set at the price of production of the lowest, least productive producer in the market. Okay. Now, if you could expand production in D, in other words, if there could be another quarter of wheat produced by D by just buying a bit more land or something, having access to a bit more land, and therefore rather than 4/4 they produce 5/4, that could squeeze producer A out of the market, right? And it would also reduce the price of production. Okay, so you have an expansion of the most productive producer, reduces the modal price of production, and reduces the market price. This is a very close simile to Saudi Arabia and the world's oil supply. Okay, next. So the false social value occurs, as I've said, the point comes from Marx, because of the limited availability of the more fertile soils, right? If you were available to expand it, this is an example, therefore, that of some capitals operating under more favorable conditions than others. They are taking the favorable conditions from nature and, if you like, turning them to their advantage, their particular advantage, rather than the advantage of the capital as a whole in this case, right? That means that society as a whole is paying a higher price than it would have done if it was possible to expand production without the limit on the fertility, right? Now, Marx asks this question, and he actually gives 2 answers, but I'm just going to posit it for now, because maybe because of time we'll discuss it, right? What does it take to abolish false social value? Okay, how can we get rid of false social value? He actually posed that question. Right, next, please. So Marx was talking about agriculture. There are a couple of amendments one has to make. The theory is quite similar, but in an amended form, if you're looking at extraction, right? Marx, rather surprisingly, makes a note a couple of times. He assumes that you don't need much capital investment in mining. It's just not the case, certainly not now, and it's certainly not the case for oil. Oil requires a lot of capital investment. But it is the case that there's not really a big factor of absolute rent income when it comes to oil. There are forms of monopoly, and the form of monopoly is different. The form of monopoly in most extractive sectors is to do with imperialism. It's especially so in colonial or neo-colonial conditions, where the active capitalist tends to keep a lot more of the surplus profit because the landowner, in inverted commas, is the original occupiers or people of that country, right? In other words, the right of private property is an imperialist right rather than an equalized right. Okay. There's also another difference with agriculture, which is very much the case that to some degree it also obtained in agriculture, I have to say. So it's not like a cast iron rule, but as a tendency, there's a depletion issue with natural resources. In other words, the rate of depletion is really a crucial factor in the profitability. So you might think of an oil field which you can try and get extract the oil very quickly, or try and have it as an extended lifespan. And so the question, the time dimension of natural resources as a capital asset is really important. Okay. The other thing is, this is discounted. This is the next point I've got on the slide. And the other thing, of course, is the huge ecological and environmental issues, which also pertain obviously in agriculture, but even more acutely in terms of extractive industries. Next, please. You may recognize the photo. The Economist wrote about Saudi Arabian politics as though it was even worse than Game of Thrones. This is a very typical Economist statement, by the way, because there's obviously a lot of truth in it, but they kind of like miss the bigger point, right? Because the Game of Thrones is not only about one kingdom, it's about a universe of powerful competing kingdoms. But I mean, just taking the image a bit further, I mean, it did end badly, to say the least. Game of Thrones in every sense, right? And you know, there was a moment where it has not completely dispersed. There could well be a moment where things end very badly. Okay, next, please. So we're in the third part of the talk now. What I'm doing here is very standard presentation. This is from the Financial Times, of the three major players, the three kingdoms in this Game of Thrones drama. Okay, so the light blue line is the big ascending power, which is US oil production, right? You can see, I mean, we'll have another graph in a minute which shows that US oil production really picked up around about 2008, okay, and overtook all other competitors, the two main ones being Russia and Saudi Arabia. Now, I will comment on this a little bit more, but I want you just to look at a particular detail of the cyclamen or pink line, which is Saudi Arabia, between 2015 and 2017, right? It slightly increased its production, only slightly, but that slight increase in production from Saudi Arabia was enough to bring down the price of oil quite precipitously. So up until 2015, peak prices of oil were over $100, and then they came down to about $60 by 2017. Right, so there's an awful lot of potential game theory about how these three actors play their hand. It's almost like a very complex poker game going on. But what I'm trying to explain is that this poker game is not detached from the fundamental economic drivers, rather than it's an expression of them. Okay, next one. This is a variation on the theme, which I hope you're becoming a bit familiar with now. This again is another example of a cost curve. This one is slightly different. The consultancy doing this one has projected reserves rather than current production, but it does make a very interesting point. Okay, first of all, the gray oblong towards the left, currently producing fields probably break even at the margin at about $50 per barrel. The average cost of production is much lower, $26 a barrel. This is the false social value that I was speaking of earlier. But towards the right of the graph, you can see these are reserves, but it's very similar to increasing production, basically from a different perspective. And you can see all the other parts of the world which they have their eyes on in terms of what could potentially come into production, right? Liquids, offshore production, and so on. Okay, the Arctic is in there somewhere as well. Deep water. Okay, so in other words, the industry and its consultants has been looking to go ever deeper and further into the Earth's crust and into the Arctic and so on, at greater cost, but nonetheless still possible to keep on producing oil. Okay, next. So this is the same curve on the US, but taking a slight step back, a longer trajectory. And the reason I'm showing this is very familiar for anybody reading about the oil industry, this type of curve. If you look at around about 2005, you can see that US oil production was down to about 5 million barrels a day. And today it's even gone further than that 11 million. It's up to about 13 million barrels a day. So within just over a decade, it really picked up about 2008, 2009. In just over a decade, US oil production has increased 2.5 times. And the main sector that has taken place from is what's known as tight oils or shale oil production. Okay, so the US is the marginal cost but expanding producer. Next. Also, there's another dynamic to this, which is that over time, the shale oil production's break-even point has been coming down. So just like 7 years ago, it's about $75 a barrel, down to about $35-ish a barrel today. Okay. Next. This is quite an important one just for the detail. When we talk about cost per barrel, what are we talking about? And you'll see quite a lot of commentary don't make this clear. And some of the articles I've been reading, from the left, need to understand that to some degree the particularities or the peculiarities of this in order to be clear, right? So there's different levels of cost. The lifting cost is the pure marginal operating cost plus royalties. Now, royalties in most parts of the world don't matter too much, so it's mostly the marginal operating cost. And that's important in terms of what price you need to have to stop producing in an existing field or in an existing well. Okay, so in other words, the price of oil has to fall very low for it to become uneconomic to continue producing oil once you've set up the production. Okay, that kind of makes sense, I hope, right? And actually it's quite low even with shale oil. I mean, it's low $15 a barrel. It's probably less than $10 a barrel now, proportionately. In Saudi Arabia, it's only $3 a barrel. So each extra dollar a barrel pumped in Saudi Arabia costs them less than $3, sells for $60 or whatever. Okay, huge markup. But also lifting cost includes by convention the marginal royalties per barrel, and that is important in countries like Saudi Arabia and is actually far greater than the actual cost of production. So in other words, for every barrel of oil that's produced, you have to pay the state the royalty for that barrel of oil, which by convention in Saudi Arabia is set at 20% of the selling price. So that would be $12 a barrel, with much more than the actual cost of producing it. Now, the other costs are quite important as well.